Imagine you are standing in a narrow Montana canyon in August of 1949. The grass is waist-high and dry as paper. You are one of 15 smoke jumpers who parachuted in a few hours ago to put out what looked like a routine fire. Then the wind turns, and the fire turns with it, and it begins racing up the slope behind you faster than any human being can run. Your foreman shouts at you to drop your tools. Your shovel, your axe, your heavy pack. And here is the strange thing, the thing that has haunted researchers ever since. Most of the men did not drop them. They kept running uphill carrying 20 and 30 pounds of equipment they no longer needed, and 13 of the 15 died in that canyon. Decades later, in another fire on another mountain, investigators found the bodies of firefighters who had also died with their tools still in their hands. Why would anyone carry a shovel while running from a wall of flame? Because dropping it is not just a physical act. It is an admission. If I put down the shovel, I am not a firefighter anymore. I am just a person running. The tools were the identity, and letting go of the identity felt more dangerous than the fire. That image sits at the front of Adam Grant's book, Think Again, and it is the best possible entry point into what the book is actually about. This is not a book about being smart. It is a book about the specific mental skill of letting go, on purpose, of things you were once certain about. Grant's argument is that we spend enormous energy learning how to think and how to speak persuasively, and almost none learning how to rethink and unlearn. And in a world that keeps changing underneath us, the ability to update may matter more than the ability to know. So the question this book puts to you is uncomfortable and useful. What are you still carrying that you should have put down a long time ago? Adam Grant is an organizational psychologist and a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, where he became the youngest tenured professor and has repeatedly been rated the school's top teacher. He is one of a small number of academics who has managed to move between rigorous research and mainstream writing without losing credibility in either direction. Before Think Again, he wrote Give and Take, which examined how givers, takers, and matchers fare in professional life, and Originals, about where nonconformist ideas come from and how they spread. He co-wrote Option B with Sheryl Sandberg about resilience after loss. He also hosts a TED podcast about the psychology of working life. Think Again, subtitled The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know, was published in early 2021 by Viking. The timing matters. It arrived in the middle of a pandemic, in the aftermath of a bitterly contested American election, at a moment when the public conversation about expertise, misinformation, and vaccine hesitancy was as heated as it had been in a generation. The book does not read as a pandemic book, and it clearly was not written as one, but it landed in a world that was painfully aware of how badly people update and how quickly disagreement curdles into contempt. Grant's own background threads through the book in ways that are worth knowing. He was a competitive springboard diver as a young man, an experience that gave him an early and vivid education in coaching, feedback, and the gap between how good you think you are and how good you are. He is also, by his own account, a chronic procrastinator, someone who finishes things far too early, which is a small but telling detail about the temperament of a man who is going to spend a book arguing for slowing down and reconsidering. Structurally, Think Again moves outward in 3 concentric rings. Part 1 is individual rethinking, the work of updating your own views. Part 2 is interpersonal rethinking, the work of opening other people's minds. Part 3 is collective rethinking, the work of building families, classrooms, and organizations where reconsidering is normal rather than shameful. The book closes with an epilogue and a long list of practical actions, which is a signal about Grant's intent. He is not trying to give you a worldview. He is trying to give you a practice. The organizing idea of the first chapter is a small taxonomy that turns out to be surprisingly sticky. Grant proposes that when our beliefs come under pressure, most of us slip into one of 3 familiar modes. In preacher mode, we treat our beliefs as sacred. We are not investigating anything. We are defending a temple, delivering sermons to protect ideals we hold dear. In prosecutor mode, we turn outward. We find the flaw in the other person's argument, marshal evidence, and go for the conviction. We are not trying to understand, we are trying to win. In politician mode, we campaign. We read the room, adjust the message, and seek the approval of an audience whose favor we want, which means our stated position drifts toward whoever we are talking to. Each of these modes has its uses, and none of them is stupid. But notice what all three have in common. In every one of them, our own thinking is essentially finished. The conclusion is fixed, only the tactics vary. Grant offers a fourth mode: think like a scientist. Not scientist in the sense of a lab coat and a pipette, but scientist as a stance toward your own beliefs. In this mode, your opinions are hypotheses. You look for reasons you might be wrong rather than reasons you are right. You run small experiments. You treat a change of mind as a result rather than a defeat. This sounds like a nice metaphor until you see it tested. Grant describes research on a group of entrepreneurs in Italy who were randomly assigned to receive training in scientific thinking, learning to treat their business strategy as a theory, their customer interviews as data, and their product as an experiment. Compared with a control group given ordinary business training, the scientifically trained founders were far more likely to pivot when the evidence went against them, and they went on to generate dramatically more revenue. The control group founders fell in love with their original plan and preached it. The trained founders held their plan loosely enough to notice when it stopped working. Then Grant flips the coin and shows what happens when a brilliant person fails to make that move. He tells the story of the co-founder of the company behind the BlackBerry, a genuine technical visionary whose device essentially created the smartphone category. When the touchscreen phone arrived, he had strong, well-reasoned convictions. People wanted physical keyboards, they wanted long battery life, they wanted secure email, they did not want a computer in their pocket. He was not lazy, and he was certainly not unintelligent. He was a superb rethinker of technology who never turned that skill on his own assumptions about what customers wanted. The company's market share collapsed. That is the uncomfortable heart of the chapter. Intelligence does not protect you here. In some ways it makes things worse, because the sharper you are, the better you are at constructing airtight arguments for whatever you already believe. Mental horsepower is a tool, and like any tool it will faithfully carry you in the direction you point it. If you point it at self-justification, you will become world-class at self-justification. If the first chapter says think like a scientist, the second asks a harder question: how confident should a scientist be? Grant sets this up with a neurological curiosity. There is a rare condition in which people who have lost their sight are unaware that they have lost it. Shown an object and asked to describe it, they will confabulate an answer with total sincerity. They are not lying. Their brain has lost both the capacity and the capacity to notice the loss. Grant uses this as a metaphor rather than a diagnosis because the metaphor is devastating. Incompetence often comes bundled with blindness to the incompetence. That is the familiar territory of the Dunning-Kruger effect, and Grant handles it with more nuance than most popular treatments. The key insight is that the effect is strongest in domains where we have a little knowledge but no reliable feedback. A beginner who knows nothing at all often knows they know nothing. It is the person who has read 3 articles and watched a documentary who climbs what people jokingly call Mount Stupid, that peak of confidence that comes just before you learn enough to realize how much there is. The opposite failure gets equal time. Imposter syndrome, the persistent feeling that you do not deserve your position and are about to be found out, is usually discussed as a pure pathology. Grant argues it is more complicated. Research he cites suggests that feeling like an imposter can carry real benefits. It motivates harder work, since you believe you have something to prove. It makes you a better learner, since you are willing to ask basic questions and seek help. And it can make you a better leader, because you are less likely to assume you already have the answer. The target Grant names is confident humility. It is not a compromise halfway between arrogance and self-doubt. It is a specific and slightly strange combination, having faith in your capacity to figure things out, while doubting whether your current tools and current answer are the right ones. Confidence in yourself as a learner, humility about yourself as a knower. The example he uses is a candidate in Iceland's presidential race in 2016. She entered polling at around 1%, an outsider running against established figures. Rather than projecting the usual manufactured certainty, she campaigned on candor. She acknowledged what she did not know. She engaged with young voters directly and answered questions instead of deflecting them. She finished second with close to 30% of the vote, a stunning result in a field where confidence is treated as the whole currency. Her humility read not as weakness, but as trustworthiness. The practical instruction here is one of the sharper lines in the book, at least in spirit. The goal is not to be right, it is to get it right. If your identity is attached to being right, every piece of contrary evidence is an attack. If your identity is attached to getting it right, contrary evidence is a gift. Grant devotes a full chapter to a feeling most people never develop, which is genuine pleasure at discovering an error in your own thinking. He explains the resistance in terms of what psychologists have called the totalitarian ego, an inner dictator whose job is to keep threatening information out. When a cherished belief is challenged, the ego does not evaluate. It defends borders. Two familiar distortions do the work. Confirmation bias makes us see what we expect to see. Desirability bias makes us see what we want to see. Grant notes that the second is often the stronger of the two, and it is much less discussed. We are not merely lazy pattern matchers. We are motivated ones. The way out, he argues, is to detach in two directions. Detach your identity from your opinions, so that being wrong about a thing does not mean being defective as a person. And detach your present self from your past self, so that the fact that you used to believe something is not evidence that you must continue believing it. Grant points out how odd our standards are here. In most areas of life, we celebrate improvement. Only with opinions do we treat consistency as a virtue and revision as a character flaw, calling people flip-floppers for the crime of learning. He tells the story of a super forecaster who, in the run-up to the 2016 American presidential election, publicly gave a much higher probability to an outcome that nearly every pundit and model dismissed. What made him accurate was not a secret model or inside knowledge. It was a habit of updating constantly in small increments as new information arrived, and an absence of ego investment in any prior forecast. This connects to a long line of research on forecasting showing that the best predictors are not the ones with the grand unifying theory. They are the ones who hold many partial theories loosely and revise often, while the confident single-theory experts frequently perform no better than chance. The emotional model Grant offers comes from a story about a legendary psychologist who, when presented with evidence that contradicted his own published work, responded with visible delight rather than defensiveness. His reaction was essentially, "Wonderful, I was wrong. Now I know something I did not know this morning." Grant's point is that this reaction is learnable. Most of us experience being wrong as a small humiliation. It is possible, with practice, to experience it as an upgrade, because that is literally what it is. The moment you discover an error is the exact moment you become less wrong than you were. The first section closes by moving from solitary rethinking to the friction that makes rethinking possible. The Wright brothers, Grant notes, argued relentlessly. They would spend hours in fierce debate about a design problem, sometimes to the point of switching sides and arguing each other's positions. This was not a dysfunction they overcame on the way to flight. It was part of the machinery that got them there. The distinction that makes this useful is between two types of conflict. Relationship conflict is personal and emotional. It is about clashing personalities, resentment, and disrespect, and it is almost uniformly corrosive. Task conflict is about the work itself. It is disagreement over ideas, approaches, and evidence. Research suggests that high-performing teams do not have less conflict overall. They have a different mix, low relationship conflict and high task conflict, particularly in the early and middle stages of a project when the direction is still being set. The problem is that most groups drift the wrong way. Harmony feels like health, so teams suppress task conflict to protect feelings, and the unspoken disagreements curdle into relationship conflict anyway. Grant's most practical contribution here is the idea of a challenge network. Most of us carefully cultivate a support network, people who encourage us, believe in us, and tell us we are doing well. That network is necessary, and it is not enough. A challenge network is a deliberately chosen group of people whose job is to point out what you are getting wrong, who you trust enough to believe they are doing it because they want you to succeed. These are the people Grant elsewhere calls disagreeable givers, prickly in style, generous in intent. They are exhausting to be around and enormously valuable, and organizations tend to weed them out for being difficult. He points to a moment at Pixar when a director, brought in from outside to make a film that many thought was unmakeable, deliberately recruited the frustrated, dissatisfied people in the building, the ones with radical ideas and a chip on their shoulder. He gave the malcontents a mission. The studio also institutionalized this through a group whose entire function is to tear early cuts of films apart, with a critical constraint. They can diagnose problems and give candid reactions, but they have no authority to dictate solutions. Criticism without control. That combination is what makes candor survivable. The prerequisite for all of this is psychological safety, which Grant is careful to define correctly, because it is one of the most widely misunderstood ideas in management. Psychological safety is not niceness, comfort, or lowered standards. It is the shared belief that you will not be punished for taking an interpersonal risk, for admitting an error, asking a naive question, or disagreeing with your boss. The research origin story is a good one. A researcher studying medication errors in hospitals found that the better-performing teams reported more errors, not fewer. At first, this looked like a contradiction. It turned out the good teams were not making more mistakes. They were surfacing them, which is why they could fix them. Part 2 turns outward. If rethinking yourself is hard, opening someone else's mind is harder, and Grant argues that nearly all of our instincts about how to do it are backwards. He opens with a public debate between a world-class human debate champion and an artificial intelligence system built to argue. The machine had access to a vast library of evidence and could produce a torrent of well-sourced arguments. The human won, and the way he won is instructive. He did not out-evidence the machine. He acknowledged what was true in its case, found common ground with the audience, spoke to their motivations, and made a small number of arguments carefully rather than many arguments quickly. That pattern shows up in research on negotiation that Grant draws on, in which expert negotiators were observed and compared with average ones. The experts behaved differently in several consistent ways. They spent far more of their time searching for common ground before contesting differences. They asked substantially more questions, so that a much larger share of their comments were inquiries rather than assertions. They commented on their own feelings and on the process of the conversation itself, saying things like, "I am not sure how to reconcile these two positions," which is oddly disarming. And critically, they offered fewer reasons for their position, not more. That last finding is the counterintuitive one. Most of us assume that if one good argument moves someone a little, 5 good arguments will move them 5 times as much. In practice, piling on arguments invites the listener to search for the weakest one and dismiss the whole case through it. It also makes you sound like you are selling. A small number of strong reasons, held with some openness, lands better than an avalanche. The experts also avoided what the research calls the defend-attack spiral, where each side escalates, and they steered clear of irritators, those self-congratulatory phrases like calling your own proposal a generous offer, which reliably provoke the other side. Grant's framing is that a good disagreement is a dance, not a war. In a war, someone must be defeated. In a dance, you have to move together, which means paying attention to your partner's steps. He also warns against becoming a logic bully, someone who overwhelms opponents with relentless rationality and mistakes their exhausted silence for agreement. Winning an argument and changing a mind are simply different activities, and pursuing the first usually forecloses the second. If the debate chapter is about how to argue better, the next step is more radical. Often the best way to change someone's mind is not to argue at all. Grant explores this through motivational interviewing, an approach developed in clinical psychology for helping people with addiction and later applied far more broadly. Its core premise is that when we push people, they push back. Direct persuasion triggers reactance, the instinct to defend our freedom to believe what we choose. So instead of pushing, the interviewer helps the person discover their own reasons for change. The practice has a few recognizable elements. Asking open-ended questions rather than leading ones. Listening reflectively, mirroring back what you heard so the person hears their own reasoning out loud. Affirming the person's autonomy explicitly, making clear that the decision is genuinely theirs. And a particularly elegant technique, asking someone to rate their readiness to change on a scale from 1 to 10, and then, whatever number they give, asking why it is not lower. That question invites the person to voice their own arguments for change, which are far more persuasive to them than yours will ever be. The case Grant uses is a physician in Quebec who visited new mothers in maternity wards to talk about vaccination. He did not arrive with statistics or lectures. He asked questions, listened to their concerns without judgment, answered what they asked, and left the decision with them. Conversations of roughly 20 minutes measurably increased vaccination rates in those hospitals compared with standard practice. The information available to those mothers had not changed. The relationship in which the information arrived had. Grant also tells the story of a Ugandan government minister who went into the bush, at considerable personal risk, to make contact with a violent rebel movement, and whose principal method was sustained, patient listening over long periods. It is an extreme case that makes an ordinary point. The rarest thing you can offer a person who disagrees with you is the experience of being genuinely heard. The same section addresses prejudice, where Grant is careful about what actually works. Simply presenting counter-evidence about a group tends to fail. What has more promise is destabilizing the stereotype itself by making its arbitrariness visible. In studies with fans of rival sports teams, prompting people to consider the counterfactual that if they had grown up in a different city, they would be wearing the other team's colors, softened hostility toward the rival's supporters. He also revisits the famous summer camp experiment in which researchers manufactured hostility between two groups of boys and then dissolved it by creating shared goals that neither group could accomplish alone. Grant adds an honest caveat that popular retellings usually omit. An earlier attempt at this same experiment had failed when the boys figured out they were being manipulated and united against the researchers instead. Even our canonical findings about rethinking deserve rethinking. Part 3 moves to the collective, and it starts with the state of public argument. Grant identifies binary bias as a central culprit. This is our tendency to compress complicated, continuous questions into two opposed camps. Are you for or against? Do you believe or not believe? Almost no interesting question has two answers, but two answers is what our media environment, our politics, and our own cognitive economy prefer. The antidote he proposes is complexifying, deliberately introducing nuance and gradation into contested topics. In one line of research at a lab devoted to studying difficult conversations, participants who read a nuanced article presenting a contested issue as having many competing considerations went on to have far more productive discussions with people who disagreed with them, compared with participants who read an article structured as two opposing sides. Same topic, same underlying facts, radically different conversational outcomes, determined by how the question was framed before anyone opened their mouth. Grant applies this to climate change, noting that treating the public as believers and deniers erases the large middle who are concerned but uncertain, cautious, or disengaged, and who are precisely the people most open to persuasion. The binary framing does not just describe polarization. It manufactures it by telling everyone that there are only two places to stand. He also offers a counterintuitive note for communicators. Adding caveats and acknowledging uncertainty is widely feared to undermine credibility. The evidence suggests the opposite in many contexts. Expressing appropriate uncertainty and acknowledging competing considerations often makes an argument more persuasive to a thoughtful audience, and it earns the standing to be believed later. Two of the strongest chapters in the book deal with the institutions that shape whether rethinking is even possible. In education, Grant challenges the lecture as a default. He notes that active learning methods, where students wrestle with problems, teach one another, and construct understanding, consistently outperform straight lecturing across large numbers of studies, with meaningfully lower failure rates. He profiles a middle school teacher who has her students examine outdated textbooks and identify what they got wrong, which transforms knowledge from a fixed object to be memorized into a living thing that gets revised. Once a child has caught a textbook being wrong, they never again believe that authority and accuracy are the same thing. He also tells the story of a first-grade boy asked to draw a scientific illustration of a butterfly. His first attempt is a child's blob. Rather than praising it, His classmates give him specific, kind, and helpful critique. He draws it again and again. Through 6 drafts, with peer critique between each, the drawing becomes genuinely accurate and beautiful. The lesson is not that the boy was talented. It is that the gap between draft 1 and draft 6 is a normal, teachable process that most of us never learn to apply to our own thinking. In organizations, Grant contrasts performance cultures with learning cultures. In a performance culture, excellence in execution is the highest value, mistakes are costly, and doubt is dangerous. In a learning culture, experimentation and revision are expected, and admitting uncertainty is a sign of competence rather than weakness. His central case is NASA, and it is a hard one. He traces both shuttle disasters, and the pattern is grimly similar. In each case, there were engineers with real concerns. In each case, those concerns were subject to a burden of proof so heavy that the absence of definitive evidence of danger was treated as evidence of safety. NASA had one of the most impressive performance cultures ever built, and that was precisely the problem. A track record of success made the assumptions feel proven. Grant highlights an astronaut who later ran a NASA center and made a habit of 2 questions in every meeting: what is your data, and what is your logic? Those questions do something subtle. They shift the discussion away from status and confidence and toward evidence and reasoning, and they make it acceptable for a junior person to speak. Related is the distinction between outcome accountability and process accountability. If you judge only by results, people learn to hide bad results and to defend lucky decisions that happen to work. If you also audit the quality of the reasoning that produced a decision, you can recognize that a good decision can produce a bad outcome and a terrible decision can get lucky. Grant recommends practices like the pre-mortem, where before launching, a team imagines the project has failed spectacularly and works backward to explain why, which gives people permission to voice doubts that would otherwise stay private. The final chapter is the most personal, and for many readers it is the one that lands hardest. Grant starts with a question we ask every child: what do you want to be when you grow up? He argues it is a subtly damaging question. It frames identity as a single destination, implies that a career is a thing you become rather than a thing you do, and sets up the expectation that you will choose once and be done. Psychologists call the resulting trap identity foreclosure, committing to a sense of self before exploring alternatives. Combine that with escalation of commitment, our tendency to double down on a losing course because of what we have already invested, and you get people spending 20 years in a life they chose at 19 and stopped examining at 22. The fix he suggests is modest and doable. Schedule career checkups the way you schedule physicals, perhaps twice a year, and ask real questions. Am I learning? Does the work still fit who I have become? What would I choose if I were starting fresh today? The point is not to quit. The point is to make continuing an active choice rather than a default. Grant also takes aim at the advice to find your passion, noting that passion is more often developed through sustained engagement and growing competence than discovered fully formed. Waiting for a lightning strike keeps people paralyzed. Committing to something interesting and getting good at it tends to generate the feeling they were waiting for. And he applies the same logic to happiness, citing the finding that pursuing happiness directly often makes it more elusive, partly because we mistake happiness for pleasure and partly because constantly evaluating whether we are happy interferes with being happy. Meaning, contribution, and interest tend to be better targets, with happiness arriving as a byproduct. Let me pull the threads together into the things most worth carrying out of this book. First, notice which mode you're in. When your view is challenged, ask yourself honestly whether you are preaching, prosecuting, or campaigning, and whether the scientist option is available. Simply naming the mode weakens its grip. Second, aim for confident humility. Trust your ability to figure things out while doubting that your current answer is the final one. Keep a running list of things you have been wrong about, not as self-punishment, but as evidence that updating is something you actually do. Third, build a challenge network, not just a support network. Identify 3 or 4 people who will tell you the truth. Tell them explicitly that this is what you want from them, and then respond to their criticism in a way that makes them willing to do it again. Fourth, when you disagree, ask more and assert less. Offer fewer, better reasons. Find the common ground first. Ask what evidence would change the other person's mind, and be ready to answer the same question about yourself, because if nothing would change your mind, you are not holding a belief, you are holding a loyalty. Fifth, resist the binary. When a topic is presented as two camps, look for the continuum. Nuance is not weakness. It is usually accuracy. Sixth, separate decisions from outcomes. Audit your reasoning, not just your results, and run pre-mortems before you commit. Seventh, treat your plans as drafts. Career checkups twice a year. Ask whether you are continuing because it is right or because you have already paid for it. And running underneath all of it, rethinking is a skill with a cost. It is slower, less comfortable, and less socially rewarded than certainty. Grant's claim is that it pays anyway, and that the alternative is spending your life defending a version of yourself that expired years ago. There is a reason Grant ends the book with a long list of concrete actions rather than a stirring peroration. He is not trying to convince you of a thesis. He is trying to install a habit. The thesis, if you want one, fits in a sentence. In a world that changes faster than our beliefs do, the ability to revise is more valuable than the ability to know. What makes the book work is that it takes seriously how hard this is. Grant never pretends that rethinking is a matter of good intentions. He is honest that our defenses exist for reasons, that identity is bound up in belief, that a person who changes their mind pays a social price, that organizations reward the confident and punish the doubtful. He also never pretends that all rethinking is virtuous. The goal is not endless equivocation or the pose of the person who refuses to commit to anything. Confident humility contains the word confident for a reason. You still have to act, still have to decide, still have to hold positions. You just hold them the way a scientist holds a hypothesis, firmly enough to test and loosely enough to release. Which brings us back to that canyon in Montana and the men running uphill with shovels in their hands. Grant's use of that story is not really about firefighting. It is about the fact that we all carry tools that once saved us. A belief that got us through a hard year. A skill that made our career. An identity that gave us a place to stand. These things were genuinely useful, which is exactly what makes them so hard to set down when the wind turns. So the question the book leaves you with is a personal one, and it does not have a comfortable answer. What are you certain about right now that you have not examined in years? Who in your life is willing to tell you that you are wrong, and when did you last make it easy for them? And if the evidence arrived tomorrow that one of your load-bearing beliefs was mistaken, would you feel humiliated, or would you feel, as one great psychologist apparently did, a small flash of delight at knowing something today that you did not know yesterday? That flash is trainable. Grant's whole book is an argument that learning to feel it is one of the more useful things a person can do with a life.